Welcome to Whispers After Midnight. Tonight's story takes us deep into the shadows of 1858, where pain, silence, and rebellion collided in a way few dared to imagine. This is the chilling true account of Jeremiah Cole, an albino enslaved man whose suffering marked him as an outsider, and whose breaking point turned an instrument of torture into a weapon of judgment. Jeremiah Cole was born in 1858 into a world that had already decided his fate long before he took his first breath. He was born enslaved, but what made his life immediately more dangerous was his albinism. His pale skin, light hair, and sensitive eyes marked him as unnatural in the eyes of both enslavers and the enslaved alike. On southern plantations, albinism wasn't understood as a medical condition, it was feared. Some whispered that albino children were bad omens, others claimed they were cursed by God, and a few believed they carried supernatural traits meant for punishment or sacrifice. From the moment Jeremiah was seen, he was not treated like a child, but like a warning. Unlike other enslaved children who were forced into labor early, Jeremiah was often kept at a distance, watched, mocked, and spoken about rather than spoken to. Overseers saw him as weak, fragile, and useful only as an example. His skin burned easily under the sun, his eyesight struggled in the fields, and every mistake was blamed not on exhaustion or hunger, but on what they called his defect. Even among the enslaved community, fear followed him. Some avoided him, afraid that association would bring punishment or misfortune. Jeremiah grew up isolated, surrounded by people yet completely alone, learning early that survival meant silence. This isolation planted something dangerous inside him, not rage at first, but awareness. Jeremiah listened more than he spoke. He observed patterns, cruelty, and hierarchy. He learned how power moved on the plantation and how pain was distributed. Being different kept him alive longer than expected, but it also made him unforgettable. To the overseer, Jeremiah wasn't just enslaved, he was a living symbol of control over the unnatural. And that made every act of cruelty against him feel justified in their twisted logic. What no one understood then was that this so-called curse wasn't weakening Jeremiah, it was sharpening him for what was coming. On southern plantations, albinism was not seen as a condition, it was seen as a sign of something wrong, something cursed, something not meant to exist. Enslaved people with albinism lived under a double sentence, enslaved by law and feared by belief. Overseers and owners whispered that albinos brought sickness, crop failure, or divine punishment. Some claimed they were ghosts born too early. Others said they were marked by the devil. No matter the story, the result was the same: distance, suspicion, and quiet cruelty. Jeremiah felt this separation every day. He was kept away from other children, not allowed to sleep close, not trusted with shared tasks. Even simple human contact was rare. The enslaved community, already living in constant fear, often avoided him, not out of hatred, but survival. Associating with someone believed to be cursed could draw unwanted attention, and attention on a plantation was deadly. So Jeremiah learned to eat alone, work alone, and suffer alone. His loneliness became routine, as familiar as the sound of chains or the crack of the whip. The overseers fed into these superstitions deliberately. Fear made control easier. They used Jeremiah as a warning, pointing to him as proof of what happened when nature or God was defied. If he was punished, they said it was inevitable. If he cried out, they said it was expected. His pain was treated as confirmation, not cruelty. Over time, Jeremiah became less of a person and more of a story told in whispers after dark, a living reminder that being different meant being expendable. But isolation has consequences. Cut off from comfort and community, Jeremiah turned inward. His silence grew heavier, his thoughts sharper. While others leaned on shared suffering to survive, Jeremiah survived by watching. Every insult, every glance, every superstition stacked itself inside him. What the plantation believed would break him, instead stripped away fear. When you are already treated as something unnatural, the threat of becoming a monster no longer holds power. On the plantation, power flowed in a rigid, unforgiving order. At the top sat the owner, often absent, distant, and insulated from the daily brutality. Beneath him stood the overseer, a man chosen not for mercy or intelligence, but for his capacity to enforce obedience through fear. The overseer was the owner's shadow, carrying authority without accountability. His word was law, his temper a weapon. And for the enslaved, he was the face of punishment, seen every day, unavoidable, inescapable. For Jeremiah Cole, the overseer was more than a supervisor. He was a predator who sensed weakness and difference and exploited both. Jeremiah's albinism made him an easy target. The overseer believed pain could correct what nature had failed. He assigned Jeremiah the harshest tasks, despite knowing his body couldn't endure them. Long hours under burning sun, work that strained his eyesight, labor meant to humiliate rather than produce results. When Jeremiah stumbled or slowed, the overseer didn't see exhaustion. He saw defiance. Cruelty became ritual. Punishments were public, deliberate, and theatrical. The overseer understood that fear spread faster when witnessed. Jeremiah was whipped not only for mistakes, but to remind others of their place. Each lash reinforced the hierarchy: white over black, free over enslaved, overseer over body. The whip was never just leather, it was authority made physical, and the overseer wielded it with pride, believing himself untouchable, protected by law, distance, and silence. But hierarchy breeds arrogance. The overseer mistook obedience for submission and silence for weakness. He never noticed how Jeremiah watched him, how he learned his habits, his moods, the moments when his guard dropped. The overseer believed the system made him powerful. What he didn't understand was that the same system was grinding Jeremiah down, removing everything except one dangerous thing: the willingness to act without fear of consequence. On the plantation, the whip was more than a tool. It was a language. It spoke when words were unnecessary, when explanations were forbidden, when mercy was considered weakness. Its sound alone could silence a field. The crack through the air carried authority, warning, and promise all at once. Long before it ever touched skin, the whip had already done its work. It reminded the enslaved that their bodies were not their own, that pain could be summoned at will, and that resistance, real or imagined, would always be answered. For the overseer, the whip was an extension of himself. He carried it openly, let it hang at his side like a badge of office. He cleaned it, maintained it, and used it often. Each strike was meant to reinforce hierarchy, to erase individuality, to reduce human beings to motion and obedience. The whip did not need a reason. Sometimes it fell because someone worked too slowly. Sometimes because someone looked up. Sometimes because the overseer simply needed to remind himself that he was in control. Jeremiah understood the whip differently. To him, it was a constant presence, etched into memory, sound, and flesh. He learned its weight by watching it swing. He learned its rhythm by counting lashes meant for him and others. He learned its meaning not as discipline, but as domination. Every scar it left behind was a message written on the body: you are owned. And yet, the more Jeremiah endured, the more the whip changed in his mind. It stopped being mysterious. It stopped being sacred. It became familiar. That familiarity was dangerous. What was meant to inspire fear slowly lost its power. The whip was no longer just an object of suffering. It was an object Jeremiah understood intimately. He knew how it moved, how it tightened, how it could bind as well as strike. The overseer believed the whip made him untouchable. He never imagined that the very symbol of his authority could be stripped of its meaning and turned against him. Punishment on the plantation was never meant to correct behavior. It was meant to erase will. For Jeremiah Cole, punishment became routine, predictable, and relentless. It didn't matter how carefully he worked or how quietly he moved. His existence alone seemed to offend the overseer. Each infraction, real or imagined, was met with lashes, confinement, or deprivation. Over time, the body learned to endure pain, but the mind carried a heavier burden. The anticipation became worse than the punishment itself. Every footstep behind him, every sudden silence in the field, signaled what was coming next. What made it unbearable wasn't just the pain, it was the meaning attached to it. Jeremiah wasn't punished because he failed, he was punished because he was. The overseer framed every beating as justified, as necessary, as inevitable. This constant reinforcement stripped away hope. When suffering has no end and no logic, the mind searches for escape, not freedom, but relief. Jeremiah stopped expecting mercy. He stopped imagining survival beyond the next day. Something inside him hardened, not into anger at first, but into detachment. That detachment marked the breaking point. Fear slowly lost its grip. Pain no longer served as a warning. It became background noise. When a person reaches that state, threats lose their power. The overseer believed Jeremiah was finally broken, finally submissive. But what he was witnessing wasn't surrender. It was the moment when a man with nothing left to lose stops measuring consequences. Repeated punishment had not crushed Jeremiah's spirit. It had emptied it, leaving behind a dangerous clarity. It didn't happen during a rebellion. There was no riot, no shouting, no warning. The night everything went wrong arrived quietly, like most turning points do. The plantation had settled into its usual darkness, broken only by insects and distant murmurs of exhaustion. The overseer, confident in his authority and untouched by fear, moved through the grounds the way he always did, careless, unguarded, certain that nothing and no one could challenge him. Jeremiah was already past the point of hesitation. The day's punishment had been especially brutal, not because of a mistake, but because the overseer needed to remind himself of his power. Something in Jeremiah shifted that night. Not anger, clarity. The rules that had governed his survival no longer applied. Obedience had brought pain. Silence had brought pain. Endurance had brought pain. The system had closed every door except one. The overseer approached him the way he always did, whip in hand, words sharp, authority unquestioned. He expected the usual response: lowered eyes, stillness, fear. What he didn't expect was resolve. In that moment, the hierarchy failed. The roles blurred. The distance between master of punishment and object of suffering collapsed. The overseer was no longer a symbol. He was just a man standing too close to someone he believed incapable of action. What happened next wasn't planned over weeks or spoken aloud. It was the result of years compressed into seconds. The night swallowed the sound. By the time others sensed something was wrong, the balance of power had already shifted, irreversibly. The plantation, built on fear and certainty, would never feel the same again. What followed was not an act of rage, but a reversal. In that brief, terrible moment, the symbol of absolute control changed hands. The whip, so long used to command, to punish, to humiliate, lost its authority the instant it was no longer wielded by the overseer. Power on the plantation had always been performative, dependent on belief and fear. When that belief cracked, everything else followed. The overseer struggled to assert dominance, reaching for threats that had always worked before. But threats only matter when the listener still fears consequences. Jeremiah did not. Years of suffering had stripped fear away, leaving a stark, terrifying calm. The hierarchy that protected the overseer, law, distance, routine, meant nothing in the darkness. There were no witnesses who could intervene, no authority to appeal to, just two men and the weight of what had been done for far too long. The whip, once an instrument of endless pain, became something else entirely, a mirror held up to the system that created it. In that instant, the overseer was forced to confront the same helplessness he had inflicted so casually. The roles reversed without ceremony or justice, only inevitability. The plantation's rules had taught Jeremiah exactly how power worked. That knowledge, once absorbed, could not be unlearned. By the time silence returned, the meaning of the whip had changed forever. It no longer represented unquestioned authority. It represented the danger of cruelty left unchecked. The act itself would be spoken of only in whispers, if at all. But its impact rippled outward, unsettling the certainty that had ruled the plantation for years. The weapon, meant to keep people obedient, had become proof that even the most brutal systems contain the seeds of their own undoing. By morning, the plantation felt different, though no one spoke of it openly. Silence spread faster than panic. The body was discovered, but the truth of what happened was quickly buried beneath fear and self-preservation. Overseers and owners understood one thing immediately. This was not just a killing. It was a fracture in the illusion of control. If word spread too clearly, it could ignite something they could not contain. So the story was distorted, softened, and in some cases erased entirely. Jeremiah himself vanished from official accounts almost at once. There was no public trial, no clean record of punishment, no formal acknowledgement of his existence beyond whispers among the enslaved. Some said he was killed before sunrise. Others believed he was secretly transported and sold to avoid attention. A few claimed he escaped into the surrounding wilderness, helped by those who understood that what he had done was not madness, but inevitability. The uncertainty was deliberate. Ambiguity protected the system better than truth. Among the enslaved, the consequences were quieter but deeper. Fear returned, but it was altered, no longer one-sided. People spoke in low voices, late at night, about what had happened. Not as celebration, not as encouragement, but as possibility. The overseer had always seemed untouchable. Now he was proof that authority could bleed. That realization lingered long after the physical evidence was gone. The plantation tightened its rules, increased surveillance, and punished harder than before. But the damage was done. Control that relies on terror cannot survive the moment terror turns back on itself. Even unspoken, Jeremiah's act haunted the routines of the place. Every whip crack afterward carried an echo of doubt. Every order carried the memory that silence does not always mean submission. Jeremiah Cole did not enter history the way others did, through documents, trials, or preserved testimony. He entered it through absence. His name, if recorded at all, was stripped of context, reduced to rumor, or deliberately omitted. Plantations were careful about what they allowed to survive on paper, and stories that challenged the illusion of control were the first to disappear. What happened in 1858 threatened more than one overseer's authority. It threatened the narrative that brutality guaranteed obedience. Historical silence is not accidental. It is engineered. Records favored owners, not the enslaved. Acts of resistance were reframed as madness, accidents, or erased entirely. Jeremiah's story survived only in fragments. Whispered recollections, second-hand accounts, and fearful warnings passed down quietly. Over time, even those whispers faded, replaced by safer, more convenient versions of the past. A man who endured years of cruelty and broke the system's rules became inconvenient to remember. And yet, silence does not mean insignificance. Jeremiah's legacy lives in what followed: the tightened grip, the unease, the unspoken awareness that power enforced through violence is never absolute. His story represents countless others whose breaking points were never recorded, whose resistance never made it to ink or archive. Remembering Jeremiah is not about glorifying what happened. It is about confronting the cost of erasure. In the end, Jeremiah Cole became what the system feared most. Not a rebel leader, not a symbol celebrated in history books, but proof. Proof that even the most dehumanizing systems cannot fully extinguish agency. Proof that silence in the records does not equal silence in reality. And proof that some stories, no matter how deeply buried, continue to surface, whispering their truth long after the world tried to forget them.